My wife humiliated me in front of her lover, so I bought the company and fired them both. She tried to get back with me, but I was already moving on with my life, and no, this is not a story about overcoming. It's about pain, humiliation, revenge, and that moment when you realize you don't know the person with whom you shared years of your existence. The truth is that no one is prepared for the sound of a mocking laugh coming from the mouth of someone who once whispered promises of eternity. I thought I was strong until I heard my wife say to her lover, "He still thinks he's the boss here." And laugh. They laugh as if I were a nuisance. As if all the years of sacrifice, nights spent in vain to build what we had, were trash. As if the man who helped her pay the first installments on the apartment was now just an insignificant detail. I watched it silently, inside burning, feeling every fragment of my dignity crumble like paper in the rain. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scandal. I watched. I memorized every gesture, every look, every subtle touch in between. The kind of touch that only exists when two people are not afraid of being discovered, because they know that, deep down, the other is already defeated. Her gaze no longer held shame or guilt. Just a cold kind of contempt. And his was a look that knew. I knew I was winning. And maybe he was. Because at that moment I was reduced to nothing. The worst thing is that it wasn't even sex that destroyed me. It was laughter. The disdain. The certainty that I no longer had value as a man, as a professional, or as a human being. She didn't cheat on me with another body. She betrayed me with her soul. And in doing so, he destroyed a part of me that I didn't even know existed. But betrayals have a price. And I knew exactly how much that price was. In fact, I knew him better than anyone. Because I was the one who built the company where they met, where they started to get closer, where she started to leave later under lame excuses like, "We are closing the month," or "The team is overworked." I knew every sector, every gear, every opportunity hidden in the reports that she pretended not to understand. I trained her. I took her from zero to the top. And it was there, on that top that I built for her, that she opened her legs for another man. But it wasn't just any man. He was the type of man who charmed himself with a handshake, who manipulated with an easy smile, and who always knew he would rise quickly, as long as he slept with the right person. They laughed at me in the parking lot of the company I founded, like two teenagers who steal their parents' car and think they're adults. And while she said, between one drag and another, that I was too old for this game, he leaned against her with the naturalness of someone who had been there for a long time. "He has no idea what happens in here," she said. And he responded with that crooked, convinced smile, placing his hand on her waist with the intimacy of someone sleeping in my bed. I watched it from inside the car, behind the tinted windows, breathing deeply, as if the oxygen would stop me from doing something crazy. But I didn't. At least not at that moment. I returned home, sat in the armchair she chose for the living room and stared into space. The silence was deafening. I could have sworn I could still smell his perfume permeating the air, mixing with hers. A smell that now disgusted me. My cell phone vibrated. "Will it be long? I made your favorite meal." She was good at it. To maintain the appearance that everything was going well. In covering up guilt with calculated gestures. But I didn't respond. I just looked at that message and thought about how many times she must have typed to him while claiming to be too busy to talk to me. I decided at that moment that I would not stoop to confrontation, shouting, or pleading. I would destroy them both, but I would do it with the same coldness with which they threw me away. The next day, I called my lawyer. In less than a week, the paperwork was ready. A clause there, a silent movement there. Nobody knew, but I was repurchasing the company from which I had temporarily left for health reasons. An orange background, 2 cover partners and the name that would never appear linked to me again. Meanwhile, she continued to treat me like an alienated husband. I kept arriving late, talking about goals and reports, without knowing that each sentence gave me more ammunition. And him? Well, he was already walking around the building as if he were the new owner. Little did he know that he was signing his own demise with every project he presented. A man without substance, but with a lot of charm, the perfect combination for ruin. The day of the assembly arrived. I entered the room with my face serene, but my heart on fire. She was there. Him too. She smiled, surprised, pretending to be happy. "Love, I didn't know you were coming," he said, with a gleam of concern in his eyes that he tried to hide with a fake kiss on the cheek. And he greeted me like someone shaking hands with the living dead, out of formality, without a soul. And then, the announcement, change of share control, new management, and the immediate dismissal of 2 strategic positions, due to conflict of interest and breach of professional ethics. She turned pale. He widened his eyes. Nobody understood anything. But I do. Because everything was under my control. For the first time in months, I was once again the architect of my destiny. She tried to talk to me in the hallway while the papers were being signed. "Are you crazy? This is ridiculous. You can't do this to me. We have history." And I just looked at her with the coldness I learned from myself. "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself." He still tried to maintain his pose, but when he saw that the access was blocked and that the security guards had already been instructed, he realized that it was the end. They went down the elevator together, she with teary eyes, he trying to find words that never came. And I watched. No pity. Because their pain was still not half of mine. Over the next few days, she tried to look for me. Songs, messages, long texts, memories of the past, travel photos, everything to touch what was left in me. But there was nothing left. I blocked her from everything, silently. And when she appeared in front of my building, in tears, asking for one last conversation, she was greeted with the image she will never forget, me holding hands with another woman. A woman she knew. That she underestimated. A strong, intelligent, successful woman, the company's new investor, who now occupied the boardroom. And unlike her, he never needed any shortcuts to conquer his space. I kissed her there, without hesitation. And my ex just watched, defeated. For the first time, she was the one outside. What she never knew was that casual dinner with the new investor took place the week after she was fired. That nothing was planned. Which came about by chance. And that, ironically, she herself had introduced that woman to me at a company event, years ago, saying, "She is too strong, you would never handle a woman like that." Maybe he was right. At that time, maybe not. But now? Now I was another man. And she, just a painful memory that was finally starting to lose color. But before all this happened, there was a night. A single night in which everything almost collapsed once and for all. A night when I discovered something about that lover, something that not even she knew. And it was this detail that made revenge even sweeter. Or cruel. It depends on how you look at it. The question is, what did I discover that night about her lover that turned everything upside down? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional, but based on real situations, to show in an intense way how betrayal corrodes relationships, destroys lives and leaves deep scars. The objective is 1, reflect on the consequences of the choices we make. Now, take a deep breath. 'Cause what will you hear? It's shocking. Get ready for a story that will stir your emotions. From the beginning, Ethan always believed that true love didn't come with bursts of unbridled passion or theatrical gestures. For him, love was consistency, it was the way someone remembered your favorite coffee without asking, how he knew how to remain silent in times when silence said more than any words. And it was like that, in a chance meeting at an innovation conference, that he met Claire. She was an up-and-coming financial analyst invited to speak on risk management while he presented the results of the technology startup he had founded at 28. The two crossed paths during one of the breaks, between one coffee and another, and all it took was an exchange of glances, curious, attentive, for destiny to begin to shape what would become the most solid and significant relationship of their lives. Claire was elegant in a subtle way, nothing extravagant, but always impeccable. Her eyes demonstrated a rare kind of practical sensitivity, a combination that made her intriguing. Ethan, with his serene air and articulate speech, had that silent confidence of someone who had built everything with effort, brick by brick, facing a youth full of failures. They came from different worlds. She grew up in a house organized by rigid routines, bilingual education and high expectations. He, on the other hand, had to fight for every space, for every opportunity, often being his own mentor and his own hand. Still, the rapport between them was undeniable. Soon they began to share coffee, debates, ideas, then books, trips and silence. And, in a short time, life. They married 2 years after that first meeting, in a discreet outdoor ceremony, surrounded only by their closest people. Ethan had just expanded his company into the corporate sector, and Claire had accepted a leadership role at a multinational company. Both were on the rise, and even with demanding routines, they built a coexistence that, in the eyes of others, seemed balanced and inspiring. They exchanged messages during the day, had dinner together almost always, and shared Sunday mornings reading newspapers and making plans about the future. When there was a need to work together, Claire as an external consultant and Ethan as CEO, this came naturally, as another way to be involved in each other's journeys. The apartment where they lived reflected this bond, a minimalist but cozy penthouse, where every corner carried a memory of the two. The main wall of the room was filled with books and photo frames from their trips. Paris, Tokyo, Greece, Buenos Aires. Ethan loved recording everything with his analog camera, and Claire always seemed captured in some spontaneous moment, laughing, distracted, surrounded by light. The kitchen was her favorite place, while the corner office was where he spent hours immersed in reports and codes, without forgetting to pay attention to the sound of the piano that she sometimes played at dusk. Their marriage was no fairy tale, but it had roots strong enough to weather any storm. At least that's what Ethan fervently believed. Over time, Ethan's company had become one of the most respected in the sector of technological solutions for business management. He kept a low profile, refusing media appearances, always focusing on the real impact of his work. Claire, in turn, was gaining more and more space as one of the most influential female voices in the financial market. She masterfully balanced firmness and empathy, which made her respected by her peers. Many said that the two were the perfect couple, aligned, in love, successful. And they made a point of cultivating this image, not out of vanity, but because they truly believed they had found something rare in each other. Comfort, partnership, a home. But there were also invisible pressures. The silent charges. The expectations that accumulated like dust in the cracks of routine. There were nights when Ethan arrived too late, too exhausted for long dinners, and Claire was already in bed, absorbed in spreadsheets or with her head far away. There were days when she had to leave for meetings in other states, and he would be left behind with that bittersweet feeling of pride and longing. They still loved each other, at least that's what they both told themselves. But something began to slip through our fingers, that lightness of the first years, that good anxiety of reunions, that fire of kisses in the elevator. It was not the absence of love. It was the accumulation of all the other things that life piles on top of. At a certain point, to try to revive the bond, they decided to start working closer together. Claire assumed leadership of a new strategic core within Ethan's company. The decision was celebrated enthusiastically by both. They would share more time together again, exchange ideas directly, grow side by side. For the first few months, it seemed like the perfect choice. Meetings became spaces for creative synergy, dinners more frequent, touches more spontaneous. There was a new flame there, a renewal of the pact. But as the team grew and the routine intensified, Ethan became absorbed again by travel, board meetings and merger negotiations. Claire, in turn, became a reference for employees, leading projects with the same firmness as always. And, among the new talents hired, there was one in particular who started to catch her attention with specific compliments, intelligent comments and calculatedly casual glances. But that still wasn't a problem. There were still no signs. Their circle of friends was small but solid. The weekend get-togethers with other couples, the lunches with Claire's parents, the company happy hours, everything seemed to be in place. Ethan liked watching Claire in these environments, always safe, always in control. I admired her silent elegance, the way she dealt with people, the way she laughed sincerely even when the subject was trivial. He still loved her, perhaps even more than before, precisely because he now knew her flaws, her fears and insecurities. And even though she didn't say it out loud often, she still looked at him tenderly when he got lost in his own thoughts, when he adjusted his glasses in the middle of a sentence or when he returned from trips with simple souvenirs and handwritten notes. There was love. But there was also something that no one could name. On one of these work trips, Ethan found himself rethinking some choices. He felt tired. Not the relationship, but the way everything seemed to have turned into a production line: wake up, work, resolve, respond, deliver, sleep. And, in the midst of it all, the relationship seemed to survive only on autopilot. He began to reflect on how they could change this, recover the essence of the beginning, perhaps travel together again, perhaps propose a fresh start. On the plane back, he wrote a draft of a letter, one of those that is given without haste, just as a reminder: I'm here. I'm still the one who held your hand in the middle of the room when the song ended. Claire, in turn, delved deeper and deeper into the projects. The new collaborator who had caught his attention was increasingly perceptive, available and helpful. Always there, with pertinent comments, smiles at the right moments and an engaging charisma. She began to depend on his opinion in some decisions and, gradually, the professional meetings extended to coffees, then to lunches and, eventually, to laughter shared in personal conversations. Nothing off limits, yet. But the intensity with which they connected awakened a part of her that had been dormant for a long time. And that was dangerous. Despite this, when they were at home, she maintained the same posture as always. Affectionate, present, kind. Ethan, without knowing anything, felt a slight improvement. I thought that perhaps this new moment together at the company was actually strengthening the marriage. And that's why he decided to plan a surprise. Something symbolic, a gesture to remind her, and himself, of the value that love still had. He booked a special dinner, wrote a new version of that letter and even thought about taking a few days off for a trip just for the two of them. He wanted to tell her how much he still believed in us. But what he didn't know, was that the seed of what would destroy them was already planted. And that it germinated in silence, amidst looks, between lines and decisions that seemed harmless. There was still no betrayal. There was still no pain. But the soil was fertile for something that would change everything forever. It was curious how time had a subtle way of changing things. Not with noise, not with obvious ruptures, but with silences, small deviations, almost invisible subtleties that went unnoticed to distracted eyes. Ethan, increasingly involved in international expansion projects, spent long periods between meetings and trips, always making sure that Claire was okay, that everything was in order. She, in turn, maintained her routine with admirable efficiency, organizing schedules, leading teams and cultivating the image of a tireless partner. Communication between the two was still constant, but over time, it became more functional than emotional. The "I miss you" were replaced by "we need to talk about the budget," and the "good evening, love" gave way to "don't forget the meeting tomorrow at 8. And yet, everything seemed to be fine, or at least good enough. It was in this emotional gap that Adam gained space. He was one of the new managers hired by Claire to lead the innovation sector. Young, articulate, witty, one of those who dominate any environment with a mix of charm and intelligence. It didn't take long for him to become a point of reference among his colleagues and a constant support for Claire. He was always available, even after hours, always ready to help, suggest, praise. Claire, who was never the type to be easily enchanted, began to notice a lightness in him that she hadn't felt in a long time. At first, he tried to push the thought away, blaming it on tiredness, stress, and emotional need. But human beings do not distance themselves from the abyss just by recognizing it. Sometimes you even want to see what's at the bottom. The meetings with Adam, which before were just meetings on the agenda, began to extend into conversations that went beyond work. They talked about art, about childhood, about places they would like to visit. He praised her projects sincerely, and his eyes searched her in a way that made her feel seen again. Ethan, without realizing it, was spending more time trying to secure the company's future than protecting the present of his marriage. Claire didn't blame him for that. After all, she had also lost herself in her ambition to grow, to conquer, to prove to herself that she could. What she didn't expect was to find in Adam a reminder of what it was like to be desired without pressure, without demands, without weight. There was no rush. The relationship between Claire and Adam is carefully constructed, each gesture a tentative step toward the unacceptable. A lingering pat on the shoulder, a whispered compliment, a laugh shared late at night in the empty office. She told herself it was just a distraction, that she would never allow it to cross the line, that Ethan was her home. But little by little, the limit became blurred. The days became longer when Ethan traveled, and lunches with Adam became more eagerly awaited than she cared to admit. Cell phones started to be checked more frequently, mirrors were consulted with more intention. And yet, at home, everything remained the same. Ethan still hugged her when he slept. I still asked how the day was. I still believed there was safety and love there. On the night of their wedding anniversary, Ethan prepared everything with a care he hadn't expressed in a long time. He booked a restaurant she loved, ordered the wine they usually drank on their first dates and brought her a discreet, elegant necklace wrapped in a blue velvet box. Claire was surprised, touched, maybe even embarrassed. She dressed in a dress that he always praised, put on the necklace and smiled when she looked in the mirror, as if trying to remember a feeling that she no longer feels, but still respects. Dinner was light, full of good memories, old jokes, looks that tried to reconnect. Ethan talked about taking a few days off, about maybe going to Lisbon together, a city she'd always wanted to visit. Claire smiled, shook her head, said she would love it, that it would be great. But inside, there was a restlessness. She knew she had strayed further than she should have. And now, returning would require renunciations that I might no longer be ready for. Days later, Ethan was called to a conference outside the country, with the possibility of extending the trip for another week. He insisted that Claire go along, but she refused, citing projects in the delivery phase and the need to be present. He understood. I trusted her. Always trusted. He left with the tranquility of someone who believes he left his heart in good hands. But in his absence, what was just tension turned into momentum. Claire and Adam started going out after work, without disguises, without rationalizations. A dinner turned into a kiss. A kiss turned into a hotel room. And the room became a habit. The guilt came, of course. It came as an uncomfortable whisper, then as a muffled scream in the back of his mind. But guilt is also tiring. And when you get tired, it gives way to repetition. When Ethan returned, everything seemed to be on track. Claire welcomed him with hugs, with kisses, with sweet words. He asked about the trip, praised the talk he gave, admired the recognition he was gaining. But something in him began to notice the difference. It wasn't an explicit change, but details. Her scent had changed. The look was more dispersed. The cell phone, always facing down. And the hours? Inexplicably more stretched, with justifications that were not convincing. Ethan didn't want to be suspicious. I didn't want to be that paranoid man who sees betrayal in every gesture. But he wasn't blind either. This was someone who knew Claire deeply. And little by little, intuition began to speak louder. He began to observe her. Discreetly, without confrontations. He noticed the absences, the smiles on the phone, the moments when she walked away to answer calls. One day, when he returned from work early, he found 2 glasses of wine still fresh in the sink and a subtle smell of men's cologne in the hallway. Claire justified it to a customer who had come to get a signature, but her eyes gave away more than words could hide. Ethan didn't react. He just smiled and said he trusted her. But inside, his heart was beginning to shatter with surgical precision. It was like being cut from the inside slowly, without anesthesia, without pause. Over time, the truth came to light. Not through screams, nor through discovered messages. He came in an unexpected meeting in his own office, on a rainy late afternoon. Ethan had returned early from a cancelled meeting and, as he crossed the hallway towards Claire's office, he saw a scene from afar that he would never forget. The 2 of them, side by side, very close, smiling with a complicity that he knew well. There was no kiss. There was no touch. But the eyes said it all. And the eyes don't lie. He didn't enter the room. He returned silently, as if he had just buried something precious. And there, in the silence of that hallway, Ethan knew his marriage was over. That everything he built with so much zeal was handed over to another man in exchange for a temporary adrenaline rush. But he didn't scream. Didn't confront. He just let the pain settle. And while she had dinner with him that night, telling him the banalities of the day, Ethan just watched. Her every word was a blade. Every smile, a poison. And she had no idea he already knew. Not at that moment. Not like that. But to know, he knew. And the most disturbing thing was not the betrayal itself, but the way she acted as if nothing had changed. As if he was still that man who could be fooled with sweet words and impromptu dinners. She had no idea. But I was about to find out. Because Ethan had already taken the first step towards something that would change everything. And the cruelest part was yet to come. Much more than she could imagine. The night was strangely calm. Claire was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair still damp after her shower, absently watching her cell phone screen. Ethan looked at her from afar, leaning against the bedroom door, his eyes immersed in a silence that grew heavier with each second. He had spent the entire day in meetings, but that wasn't what exhausted him. What really consumed him was the weight of the decision he had made that morning, when he signed the final documents for the silent acquisition of the company. The last 2 months had been meticulously planned. Every step, every signature, every new hidden clause in the acquisition structure had been set up with the surgical care of someone preparing a precise trap. He had remained cool, controlled, invisible. Now was the time. And there was nothing left to do but watch the outcome of what was already sealed. Claire, who was still smiling with the lightness of someone who had no idea what was coming, turned around and said that she missed the times when the 2 of them would spend the night together on the couch watching nonsense. He just nodded, but inside, something was tearing. The next day, she went to a meeting hastily called by the board. He found it strange. The atmosphere was more formal than usual. Some tense faces, glances exchanged discreetly. Ethan entered the room a few minutes later, accompanied by 2 lawyers and the new chairman of the board, appointed by him. Claire swallowed. Adam was sitting next to him, restless, looking from side to side, as if he sensed something was wrong. When Ethan began to speak, time seemed to freeze. The words came precisely, like silent daggers piercing the air coldly. He announced structural changes, strategic cuts and restructuring for ethical reasons. He appointed 2 immediate dismissals for breach of trust. Claire and Adam. She tried to get up, demanded explanations, argued that it was absurd. Adam was silent, his face white as paper. Ethan looked her in the eyes for the first time during the entire speech and just said that all the evidence was already in the legal department's possession. The silence that followed was sepulchral. Hours later, she knocked on the door of his old office. The teary eyes, the trembling voice. She asked to talk, to understand the reason for that public humiliation, the contempt, the coldness with which she was treated. Ethan let her in, but remained standing, with his hands in his pockets, as if the physical distance was still small for the abyss that now separated them. She started talking non-stop, justifying it with disjointed words, saying that her involvement with Adam had been confusing, that she was lost, that she no longer knew how to deal with absences, with loneliness. That he too had walked away. He listened to everything in silence, without interrupting. When she stopped talking, trying to hold back her tears, he slowly pulled out the chair, sat in front of her and said calmly, "You betrayed me, Claire, not only with him, but with everything we built." She tried to explain herself, insisted that it had been a mistake, that nothing justified destroying what they had, that she still loved him. And then he smiled, but it was a sad, tired smile, full of something she didn't recognize. Because there was no more hurt there, there was indifference. She followed him to the parking lot, still crying, asking if it was too late, if there was any chance of rebuilding, if he loved her. But he didn't respond. He got into the car and left. Over the next few days, she tried everything. He sent long messages, letters, emails. He called at dawn, begging for a conversation. Ethan never responded. Her number was blocked, and she began to receive silence returns like a sentence. Adam, in turn, disappeared. There were no more smiles, no more conversations. Everything disappeared like smoke in the wind. And it was in this void that Claire realized that she had lost more than a man, she had lost the only one who really knew her completely and, yet, chose to love her every day. 2 months passed. A new administrator took over the position that previously belonged to Claire, young, ambitious, with an impeccable resume. She first appeared at a low-key corporate event, alongside Ethan. When Claire saw them together, her knees went weak. It wasn't just the presence of the new woman next to him, but the way he looked at her. It was different. It was light. It was real. Claire tried to hold on, but something in her chest was breaking again, deeper. And then, that same night, when their eyes briefly met, Claire found the courage to approach Ethan. He asked for 5 minutes. He, out of respect for what they experienced, accepted. They sat in a private room, while the party continued with music and muffled laughter outside. She began to talk about everything she had reflected on, about how she understood that their marriage had been slowly eroded, and that there was no going back. But she needed to know, why so much contempt? Why so cold? Why was that decision made with such precision and cruelty? Ethan watched her in silence. Then he got up, walked around the room, and then said something that completely destabilized her. "What you and Adam don't know, Claire, is that when I finalized the purchase of the company, before I even fired you two, I had already discovered that he was married. Not with just anyone, but with the new investor you introduced me to years ago, at that convention you hated going to so much. She's my partner now. And it was she who came to me, weeks ago, with the prints, the audios, with the request for help. She discovered everything when Adam left his cell phone unlocked on the table. Not just the meetings with you, but the plans, the ironies, the way you talked about me, about her, about everyone. She didn't come to me for revenge. He sought it out because he wanted to leave that marriage with dignity. And I saw it as a chance to expose the truth without having to raise my voice." Claire was silent, paralyzed. Her face paled as the words rearranged themselves in her mind. The eyes slowly widened, as if the brain refused to accept what it heard. Ethan continued. "That dinner we had, days after the dismissal, do you remember? That woman who was next to me that night, who you called too strong for you? She. The same. She knew everything. And at that moment, while you smiled at me trying to win me back, she held me under the table, reminding me of who I am. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace. Claire cried silently, her lips trembling, her hands shaking in her lap. Ethan looked at her with pity, but it was no longer the pity of someone he loves. It was the pity of someone who sees someone slowly sinking and knows that they can no longer, and should not, extend a hand. He approached the door, opened it slowly, and before leaving, he murmured in an almost soft tone, "The worst part of being betrayed wasn't losing you. It was realizing that you never saw me." Claire tried to say something, but her throat caught. When he left, she collapsed right there, alone, with no one to hold her pain. And as the music continued outside, with glasses clinking and laughter filling the halls, Claire finally understood the price of her choices. But there was still one more piece in this game, something that Ethan hadn't yet told, something that would forever change the course of everything, and that, now, was about to come to light. In the days following that devastating encounter, Claire began to live in suspense. It was as if the world continued to spin, but she was left behind, trapped in a reality that was dismantling in slow motion. His routine, previously full of appointments, calls and important decisions, was now a distressing silence. The invitations disappeared, the calls stopped, the looks of his former colleagues, the few who still crossed his path, were full of discomfort or indifference. The reputation he had built over the years had dissolved in weeks. But more than the loss of her position, career or status, what consumed her was Ethan's absence. Not as a husband, not as a partner, but as a reference. He was your ground, your compass, your silent north. And now, when she realized the extent of the betrayal she committed not only against him, but against herself, everything seemed too late. It was on a cloudy afternoon, weeks after that event, that Claire decided to try one more time. She knew that he no longer lived in the same apartment and, after some discreet contact, she discovered that Ethan was now in a new building, further away, modern, with a wide view of the urban horizon. She didn't think. He got in the car and drove there, with his sweaty hands on the steering wheel and his heart racing as if he were about to jump off a cliff. The doorman recognized her, hesitated for a few seconds, but allowed entry after confirming with the new registered phone number. She climbed the floors with a mixture of fear and hope, mentally rehearsing every word, every sigh, every attempt to convince him to listen to her without reservation. When the door opened, she saw him standing, still wearing casual clothes, as if he had interrupted something simple, a reading or perhaps a coffee. His face was more serene than before, more mature, more distant. Still, she took a chance. "I didn't come to beg," he began, his voice trembling. "I came because I couldn't live knowing that I didn't really try." He didn't respond right away. He let her enter, sit on the light sofa in the new room that bore no trace of the old life they shared. The environment was different, the colors, the objects, even the aroma of the place seemed intentionally different. Claire understood that there was a new beginning there. But still, she needed to say what had been bottled up inside her since the last time they saw each other. "I was a coward," I said, looking into his eyes. "I got lost. It wasn't just about Adam, it was about not knowing how to deal with what I became. I felt small next to you, Ethan. And instead of telling you that, of seeking your help, I tried to make myself big in the wrong way." He was silent for long seconds before finally speaking. "Do you know why it hurts so much, Claire? Because I never wanted you to be great because of me. I just wanted us to be great together." The pain in his voice was now cold, controlled, without the anger it had been before, but filled with something even more destructive, crystallized disappointment. She tried to touch him, but he retreated discreetly, not with aggression, but with the firmness of someone who no longer allows invasions. "You don't know what it meant for me to hear from the woman I loved most that she thought I was invisible. That she would laugh at me with another man, in the space we built together. I would bear anything, Claire. Anything. Minus the contempt." Her tears fell silently, as her fingers searched for something to hold on to, a pillow, her own knee, anything that would keep her from falling apart right there. But Ethan wasn't broken anymore. He had already gone through this process. And now it was she who began to follow this path of fragmentation. He got up, walked to the window and watched the city below, breathing deeply. Claire wiped her tears and, with her voice now firmer, asked if there was really another woman. If he had moved on. He turned his face slightly, without looking at her, and replied with a calm tone, "I moved on the day I realized I deserved better than someone who saw me as a security plan." Claire felt her stomach drop. Shame was mixed with a kind of perverse relief that he was still there, talking to her, explaining. But there was more. Ethan turned around, his eyes now more intense. "Do you remember that conference where you insisted that I meet that investor? The one you said was too arrogant to work with us?" Claire nodded, confused. "She is the person who has supported me the most in the last few months. But not in the way you think. She's not just a new woman in my life. She is the one who showed me the truth about you. About Adam. Above all. She was married to him for 5 years. She read each message, listened to each audio. And he gave me everything. Not for revenge, but because he wanted to free himself from the lie. And that's when I understood, while I was fighting to save our marriage, you two were making jokes about me in hidden messages. I didn't lose you, Claire. I freed myself." She tried to defend herself, to say that it wasn't like that the messages didn't represent what she really felt, that many things were said out of impulse, out of anger, out of frustration. But he no longer listened with his heart. His gaze was as distant as the sky outside. Ethan watched her for a moment, perhaps looking for some trace of that woman he fell in love with years ago. But what he saw in front of him was something else, a shadow of everything they could have been. With a suppressed sigh, he walked to the door, opened it slowly and said in a low voice, "I hope that one day you find someone who loves you like I loved you. And this time, you know what to do with it." Claire stood up, hesitantly, still wanting to say more, to justify, to beg, to scream that she was sorry. But there was a limit, and she had already crossed them all. He left without looking back, descending the elevator as if descending a sentence. Outside, the rain was beginning to fall. She got into the car and stayed there, with her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of every word, every choice, every silence. And he understood, at that moment, that the real punishment wasn't losing Ethan. It was knowing that he would never look at her the same way again. Meanwhile, high up in that bright apartment, Ethan sat back down in the armchair. He turned on some soft music, picked up a book, and allowed himself to breathe. There was no euphoria, no exaggerated relief. Just a sincere calm of someone who, after a lot of pain, was finally ready to start over. And this time, without having to erase the past. But certain that he wouldn't carry anyone else who would make him doubt himself. The next day, fate still had one last card to play, one that would put all events into perspective and reveal something that no one, not even Claire, could have predicted. And when that last piece fell into place, everything would change again. Because there are betrayals that hurt, but there are truths that destroy. And the biggest one was yet to come. Life doesn't start over with fireworks or overcoming phrases printed on the bathroom mirror. It begins again in silence, the moment the heart, tired of insisting on something that no longer exists, finally learns to beat on its own. Ethan didn't wake up feeling victorious. There was no sense of triumph, no sweet taste of justice done. What was left now was a heavy, almost melancholic calm that wrapped everything in a cloak of introspection. He followed his mornings with discipline, as he had always done, but now there was time to listen to his own thoughts, to feel each gesture as a real gesture, and not just as part of a routine mechanical gear for two. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running after anything. Not of love, not of forgiveness, not of the future. It was just existing. And that, after all, was a start. Meanwhile, Claire wandered through an opaque landscape. His home, once full of life, was now a space that hurt. The walls echoed memories, and each object became a silent witness to what she lost. Not by chance. But by choice. The dilemma that now consumed her was not about guilt, she accepted it, without reservation, but about what to do with what was left. When everything is gone, and forgiveness is no longer a possibility, what is left? How do you reconstruct a name, a story, a look in the mirror? Claire started to avoid her former colleagues, abandoned discussion forums, and disconnected from social media. His name, once circulated with respect, was now murmured ironically or forgotten out of convenience. And that, for someone like her, was a cruel punishment. Because Claire always believed that her identity was built on achievements. Discovering that, deep down, she was made up of the mistakes she tried to hide was like dying awake. There was, however, something that still drove her to get out of bed. Maybe it wasn't hope, because that no longer lived in her, but the need to understand herself. To search inside yourself where you started to get lost. She started going to a bookstore downtown, small, with high shelves and employees who didn't know who she was. There, he found a type of anonymity that became a shelter. I read about choices, about reconstructions, about pain that turns into a bridge. Not to forgive yourself, but to confront yourself. Sometimes I spent hours sitting, not touching the books, just watching people, imagining their stories. It was a silent ritual, a way of feeling that, even on the margins, you could still be part of the world. On one of those afternoons, he met Adam again by chance. He was visibly haggard, aged inside. There were no hugs, no anger, no desire. Just two bodies that were once confused in chaos and now only shared the silence of regret. They talked for a few minutes, exchanging phrases that seemed like sketches of something that would never be completed. He said that he had returned to his hometown, that he was trying to get back on his feet far away, that the marriage, as expected, had ended. Claire didn't ask any questions. I knew that nothing they said would change what they experienced, or what they destroyed. When they said goodbye, they didn't exchange promises. Just a resigned look from someone who understands that there is no way back, no way to forget. Meanwhile, Ethan focused on work. The company's new phase was promising. The decisions made in the previous months showed consistent results, and the internal environment became lighter. There was trust, harmony, and, most importantly, truth. The new partner, Isabel, was a calm, steady presence, someone who balanced intelligence with humanity. They weren't together in a romantic sense yet, but the connection between the two was deep, built on mutual admiration and silently acknowledged scars. Isabel didn't ask about Claire. And Ethan didn't talk about the past. They didn't need it. There was a tacit agreement of respect between them, each other's time, each other's space, the pains that were still slowly healing. One rainy night, Ethan received a handwritten letter. The envelope was simple, with no return address. But the trace was unmistakable. Claire. He hesitated for a few seconds before opening it. The reading was slow, dense. There was no apology, no attempts to win back. It was an honest, painful confession of everything she had experienced since the end. She spoke of loneliness, of shame, of the nights when she woke up scared remembering the sound of the door closing behind him. He talked about the books, the bookstore, how he began to observe the world from the outside, like a child spying on a party through the window. And, in the end, he just said that he didn't expect an answer. That the letter was not to reopen wounds, but to say that, even though she had destroyed everything, she finally understood the value of everything she had. Ethan folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. But he remained there, looking at the wet window, his mind immersed in an almost sad peace. It was strange, but there was something beautiful about realizing that time really does change people. Not always to save them, but to make them learn to live with the consequences of their choices. The following days continued peacefully. Isabel, who spent more time by his side, began to become a natural presence in his life. They shared coffee, ideas, silence. She was direct but kind. Strong, but empathetic. And unlike anything Ethan has known before. One day, during a business trip, the two were stuck at an airport due to a delay. They sat near the window, watching the planes take off and land under the gray sky. Between one conversation and another, Isabel looked at him and said that there was something he still needed to do. Not for Claire, not for her, but for himself. Ethan looked at her, confused. And she explained, "You need to end the cycle." Not angry. But truthfully. Clearly. With humanity. Those words echoed inside him for days. And so, he decided. Not to reopen pains, but to free yourself from them once and for all. He arranged a meeting with Claire, in a discreet café. She accepted, not knowing what to expect. When they arrived, the initial embarrassment was inevitable. But Ethan took the lead, as he always did. He said he hadn't called her to relive anything, nor to forgive. But to be grateful. Because if it weren't for the destruction, he would never have rebuilt himself. He said that he now understood that loving is not enough, that reciprocity and respect are necessary, and that the absence of this also teaches. Claire listened silently. And, for the first time, he didn't try to justify or explain himself. Just said thank you. For having loved. For being loved. And for finally being able to accept that that chapter had been closed. They said goodbye with a handshake. No kisses, no hugs, no promises. But with a dignity that only pain well experienced can bring. Ethan left there feeling lighter. And for the first time, he felt that his heart was ready. Not to start over, but to allow yourself. And what would come next, he didn't know. But he was at peace with it. Because sometimes the greatest victory is not rebuilding what was lost. It's discovering yourself whole, even after being broken. And this, he knew, was the beginning of something new. Time, with its silent precision, moved forward, and everything that previously seemed urgent was being dragged into the depths of memory like sand carried by the waves. But for every character in that story, the marks remained imprinted in places no photograph or words could ever reach. Ethan, now with a life completely different from the one he once imagined he would have, has found a kind of peace that only well-digested pain can offer. He no longer sought answers, he did not harbor any sorrows, nor did he allow himself to fall into the temptation of romanticizing a past that cost him so much his soul. The serenity that surrounded him did not come from oblivion, but from the deep and honest acceptance that not everything we love needs to be kept, and that some endings are the only possible way to save what is left of us. The relationship with Isabel blossomed slowly, like a late spring after a harsh winter. There were no dramatic declarations, no broken promises. Just the mutual decision to walk together without the rush to get anywhere. Ethan no longer looked for redemption in the eyes of another person, and this made the love that grew between them unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was a calm, mature love, made of respect, admiration and a sincere desire not to hurt. The two completed each other not by necessity, but by choice. And that, after everything he'd experienced, was a luxury Ethan never thought he deserved. In a short time, Isabel became not only his partner in his personal life, but also the force behind new business achievements, which meant that together they became a reference for ethical and visionary leadership throughout the sector. Claire, in turn, plunged into a slow, lonely journey, far from the lights, events, and connections that once made her feel invincible. After her final meeting with Ethan, something in her collapsed for good. But unlike other times, she didn't try to fix it right away. He didn't look for shortcuts, or new arms where he could hide the pain. For the first time in years, he faced the void he created. She completely abandoned her career in the corporate sector and began attending a support center for women in emotional crisis. At first, it was just as a listener, sitting at the back of the room, almost invisible. Over time, she began to speak, hesitantly, then more firmly, until her story began to touch other women who had also lost themselves in their own choices. Without searching, Claire found a new role there, listening, welcoming, guiding. He discovered that by sharing his scars, he was able to prevent other people from making the same mistakes. It wasn't about redemption. It was, at most, a way of making some sense of the damage he caused. Adam had a less poetic fate. After the divorce, he lost credibility in the market. The scandal involving his relationship with Claire and his involvement with the new investor who was his wife exposed not only his infidelity, but also unethical practices that he hid beneath his charm and superficial efficiency. Unable to reposition himself, he tried to start a business in another city, but failed due to a lack of consistency and support. He began to live with the bare minimum, surviving on sporadic consultancies and avoiding any public exposure. Little by little, people forgot his name, but he couldn't forget Claire's face. Much less Ethan's. Deep down, he knew he hadn't just been a pawn, but a man who volunteered to play, even though he knew the bet would cost more than he was willing to pay. Years later, at a philanthropic event promoted by Isabel and Ethan, Claire appeared discreetly, as one more guest among many. She was no longer the woman she used to be. There was something in her eyes, a restrained firmness, a weary softness, that revealed everything she had been through. She didn't approach Ethan, didn't try to talk. He just watched from afar, with a slight smile on his lips, and left before the night was over. Ethan saw her. And in that brief moment, he felt silent respect for the woman she had become. Not because of who went with him, but because of who he decided to be afterwards. There was no need for a wave, for words. There, among so many strangers, the two understood that the cycle had, in fact, ended. With pain, with losses, but also with evolution. Each in their own way. Ethan and Isabel, over the years, have become symbols of integrity and sensitive leadership. They invested in social projects, training programs for young people and emotional support networks within the corporate environment. They turned the place where it all began into a new space of belonging, where culture was based on truth, transparency, and empathy. Ethan's legacy was not financial success, but the strength with which he chose not to bow down in the face of betrayal, and the dignity with which he chose to rebuild his own history. There were no more traces of hurt. Just scars. And scars, when they no longer hurt, become part of the skin. Marks of a battle won from the inside out. Claire continued her active listening work, now as a group facilitator and speaker on emotional ethics and personal reconstruction. His story became an example not because of what he lost, but because of the courage to admit, publicly, that love, when mistreated, also makes those who practice it sick. His name began to circulate again in caring environments, away from the spotlight. He never married again. But not out of fear. By choice. She learned to be with herself. And being okay with that. In the end, what this story leaves us with is a simple but brutal truth: no betrayal begins at the moment of kissing or bed. It starts much earlier, the moment we stop seeing the other, the moment our desires become more important than our commitments. And the hardest part of all this is not being betrayed. It's realizing that the person you loved most never looked at you the way you looked at them. Ethan survived this. And it didn't just survive, it flourished. Claire learned from this. And, even late, he transformed pain into awareness. Adam lost everything. But with it came the reminder that not everyone has the courage to face the consequences of their actions. Some just disappear into them. Now that you've heard this full story, tell me, what would you do in Ethan's place? Do you believe Claire deserved forgiveness? And Adam, did he get the fate he deserved? Leave your opinion here in the comments. I really want to know what you think about this. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell and follow the next narratives that will change your head and your heart. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, we clearly show how each wrong choice can destroy homes, trust and even identities. Until the next story. And be careful who you trust.